Has anyone ever had this? The feeling that your heart's been kicked out from under you, like a chair you didn't know you were leaning on. You're still standing, still breathing, but something's shifted. Something's wrong. You tell yourself it's just a bad day, or a misunderstanding, or a mistake that'll fix itself if you wait long enough. But deep down, you know. You just don't want to believe it yet. That's where I was 3 months ago, standing in the garage I've owned for over a decade, staring at the same wrench I'd used 1,000 times before, and feeling like I didn't even know who I was anymore. My name's Jake, and I live in a small town in Arkansas, just south of nowhere. I fix cars, build engines, and hang out with my 6-year-old son, Robbie, who loves anything with wheels. Life's always been simple, maybe even boring. But it was mine. And until recently, I thought it was enough, for me and for Stacy, my wife. Stacy was the kind of girl who turned heads everywhere she went. Even in high school, she had this way of walking into a room like she owned it, but not in a stuck-up way. She had a laugh that made you forget your own name, and these green eyes that could stop you dead. I met her when I was 18, just after I started working at my buddy Roy's auto shop. She came in with her beat-up Chevy, asking if we could patch it up. I don't know if it was the car or the girl driving it, but I spent 2 extra hours on that job, making sure it ran better than new. By the time we got married 5 years later, she wasn't just my wife, she was my world. We bought a little house outside of town, nothing fancy, but it had a yard for Robbie to play in and a garage big enough for my tools. For a while, it felt like a movie. We didn't have much money, but we didn't need it. Nights were spent on the porch, drinking beer and talking about our dreams, laughing at Robbie's stories from daycare. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Then Stacy got that job at the modeling agency. It started small, answering phones, organizing shoots, running errands. She said it was just something to keep her busy while Robbie was at school. I thought it was a good idea. She'd been talking about wanting more for a while, though I never quite understood what more meant. I figured she'd meet some new people, maybe pick up a hobby. What I didn't figure was how fast things would change. The first sign was the clothes. Stacy's always been beautiful, but she never cared much about labels or trends. Suddenly, though, she was coming home with bags from boutiques I didn't even know existed. "It's for work," she'd say, spinning around in some designer dress. "I have to look professional." Then came the parties. At first, they were just now and then, work events, she called them. But before long, it felt like she was gone every weekend, dressed to the nines, sipping cocktails in places where guys like me wouldn't know which fork to use. I didn't say much. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who couldn't handle his wife having a life. But it started to feel like she was living in a whole different world, one I wasn't invited to. I kept busy with the garage and with Robbie. He's the kind of kid who's never met a toy truck he didn't love, and I'd started teaching him how to change oil and tighten bolts. Those were good days, even if they felt a little emptier without Stacy around. She'd come home late, smelling like wine and perfume, and I'd tell myself she was just tired. I told myself a lot of things. Then one Sunday, a new face showed up at the agency. Tony, the flower guy. He'd swing by every week with these huge, fancy bouquets, roses, lilies, orchids. I only knew about him because Stacy mentioned him once, laughing about how he always flirted with the girls at the office. "It's harmless," she said, brushing it off. And maybe it was. Back then, I didn't think twice about it. But there were other things, little things that didn't add up. Like the way she started keeping her phone face down on the counter, or how she'd smile at texts she wouldn't let me see. Or how she seemed happier when she was heading out the door than when she was coming back in. I told myself I was imagining it. We'd been together for so long, people go through rough patches, right? Maybe she was just excited about her new life, trying to figure out how it fit with the old one. I convinced myself it was temporary, that we'd find our way back to each other. I was wrong. The night everything started to unravel, I was at home with Robbie, working on a model car he'd gotten for his birthday. Stacy had texted earlier, saying she was staying late to plan a big campaign. It wasn't unusual, so I didn't think much of it. But when Robbie went to bed, I found myself staring at her phone, sitting there on the kitchen counter. I'd never been the jealous type, never felt the need to check up on her. But something about the way she'd been acting lately. I don't know. It felt off. I didn't touch it, not then. But the thought stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind like a loose thread I couldn't stop pulling. That was the moment everything shifted, though I didn't know it yet. For now, I shoved the doubts aside and went back to Robbie's room. He was already asleep, his little hand clutching the toy wrench I'd given him. I kissed his forehead, turned off the light, and went back to the garage. Sometimes, when the world doesn't make sense, all you can do is lose yourself in the hum of an engine and the feel of steel in your hands. But even the sound of a ratchet turning couldn't drown out the question I didn't want to ask: what if I'd been wrong about everything? The next few weeks passed in a haze of half-finished conversations and quiet nights that felt louder than they should. Stacy and I barely talked anymore. She was always busy, always distracted. Even when we were in the same room, it felt like we were living on opposite sides of a canyon. And every time I looked at her, I couldn't stop wondering if there was something she wasn't telling me. I tried to shake it off. I focused on work, on Robbie, on fixing up an old Mustang I'd been rebuilding for months. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, that question kept creeping back in: what's she hiding? One Friday evening, I got my answer, or at least the beginning of it. Stacy had gone to a client dinner, leaving me and Robbie to fend for ourselves. After putting him to bed, I went to the fridge for a beer and noticed her phone sitting on the counter again. This time, I didn't just stare at it. I picked it up. I told myself I was just going to check the time, but my hands had a mind of their own. The screen lit up, and there it was, a text notification from someone named T. Can't wait to see you this weekend. Same spot? My stomach dropped. My first thought was that T could be anyone, a coworker, a friend. But the way the message was worded, it didn't feel innocent. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the phone like it might explode. Every instinct I had told me to put it down, to let it go. But I couldn't. I scrolled through her messages, searching for more. There wasn't much, just a handful of texts, all vague enough to mean anything. But it was enough to plant a seed of doubt, one that grew roots in every corner of my mind. When Stacy got home that night, I didn't say anything. I watched her walk through the door, her hair perfect, her makeup flawless, her smile just a little too bright. She kissed my cheek and asked how my night was, like nothing was wrong. I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. The next day, I decided I needed answers. Not just guesses or suspicions, I needed the truth. That's how I found myself sitting in my truck on Sunday morning, parked outside her office building. Robbie was with my parents for the day, and Stacy had left hours earlier, saying she had to go in for a last-minute shoot. I waited, heart pounding, until I saw her walk out. She was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, one that hugged her in ways I couldn't ignore. She looked happy, happier than I'd seen her in weeks. And then I saw him. The flower guy. Tony. He walked up to her, holding a bouquet that was bigger than any I'd ever bought her. She laughed at something he said, that same laugh that used to be just for me. And then they got into his van together and drove off. I didn't follow them, not yet. I told myself it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe they were just friends, maybe it was work-related. But deep down, I knew better. The next week was a blur of half-truths and silent accusations. Stacy acted like nothing had changed, but I could feel the distance between us growing wider. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was that moment outside her office, the way she smiled at him, the way she laughed. I didn't want to believe it, but the doubt was eating me alive. The following Sunday, I decided to find out for sure. This time, I followed them. They drove to a small town about an hour away, to a house tucked back in the woods. It was the kind of place you'd never find unless you were looking for it. A little cabin with a wraparound porch and a view of the trees. I parked far enough away that they wouldn't see me, then watched as they walked inside together. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at that house, my mind racing with 1,000 questions I didn't want to ask. Who was this guy to her? How long had this been going on? Was it my fault? I didn't have the courage to go up to the door, to see for myself what was happening inside. Instead, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. When I finally drove home, I felt like a ghost. That night, when Stacy came back, I looked at her and saw someone I didn't recognize. She wasn't just my wife anymore, she was a stranger, someone with secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't know if we'd make it through. The days after I followed Stacy to that cabin blurred together. I went through the motions, working at the garage, dropping Robbie off at school, fixing dinner, but it felt like I was living someone else's life. Every time Stacy smiled at me or kissed my cheek, I wondered if she was thinking about him. I told myself I needed more proof before I confronted her. I couldn't just throw accusations around without knowing the whole story. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what I'd find if I dug too deep. Scared of losing the life we'd built, even if it wasn't the life I thought it was anymore. The next Sunday, I decided to follow her again. This time, I brought a pair of binoculars I'd borrowed from Roy, who used them for hunting. I parked in the same spot as before, hidden just far enough back in the woods that they wouldn't notice me. They arrived a little after noon. Stacy climbed out of Tony's van, holding what looked like a picnic basket. She was laughing, her head tilted back in that way she used to do when I told her a stupid joke. Tony grabbed her hand as they walked toward the house, and she didn't pull away. I watched through the binoculars as they went inside, leaving the door open just long enough for me to catch a glimpse of the living room. It was cozy, with a fireplace and a couch that looked like it had seen better days. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, their place. My chest tightened as I imagined them sitting on that couch, laughing, talking, maybe even. I couldn't finish the thought. I waited for hours, the binoculars clutched in my hands, watching the shadows in the windows. When they finally came back out, the sun was starting to set. Stacy's hair was a mess, and she was holding her shoes in one hand. Tony had his arm around her waist, like they'd been doing this for years. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't just a fling or a mistake. This was something deeper. Something that had been building while I wasn't paying attention. When they drove off, I didn't follow them. I sat there, staring at the house, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. The drive home was the longest of my life. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was dark, and Robbie was already asleep. Stacy's car was parked where it always was, like nothing had happened. I walked into the house and found her in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled, like everything was normal. Like she hadn't just spent the day with another man. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice casual, like she wasn't ripping my heart out with every word. "Fine," I said, sitting down across from her. "How was yours?" She shrugged. "Busy. Work stuff, you know." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah. I know." I didn't confront her that night. I couldn't. But I knew I couldn't keep pretending forever. Something had to give. The breaking point came a few days later. Stacy had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was getting ready for bed. I wasn't planning to look at it. I told myself I wasn't going to stoop that low. But then it buzzed, and there it was, another text from Tony. "Miss you already?" My hands were shaking as I scrolled through their messages. There weren't many. Stacy must have been deleting them, but what I found was enough. "Can't wait to see you again. Same time next week? You looked amazing today." It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. The messages were casual, almost innocent, but the meaning behind them was clear. When Stacy came back into the room, she froze, her eyes darting to the phone in my hand. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. I looked up at her, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't see the woman I fell in love with. I saw a stranger. "Who's Tony?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Her face went pale, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then she sighed, like she'd been caught sneaking out past curfew, not tearing our family apart. He's just a friend, she said, sitting down across from me. You're overreacting. Don't lie to me, Stacy, I said, my voice rising. I followed you. I saw you with him. Her eyes widened, and for a second I thought she was going to deny it again. But then her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. It's not what you think, she said quietly. It's complicated. I laughed bitterly. Complicated? You've been sneaking around with him for weeks, and you call that complicated? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The look on her face said it all. I got up and walked out of the room, my mind racing. I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that she cheated, or the fact that she hadn't even tried to fight for us. That night I slept on the couch. It wasn't much, but it felt better than lying next to her, pretending everything was okay. The next morning, the house was silent. Normally, Stacy and I would tag team getting Robbie ready for school, but she stayed in our bedroom while I handled it on my own. Robbie didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. He was too busy telling me about some dinosaur show he'd watched the night before, his face lit up with excitement. I forced a smile and nodded along, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Stacy and I hadn't spoken since the night before, and the weight of everything hung heavy in the air. After I dropped Robbie off, I drove to the garage, but for the first time in years, I couldn't focus. Cars came in, cars went out, but it was like my hands were moving on autopilot. All I could think about was Stacy and the mess we'd made of our marriage. Around lunchtime, Roy came into the shop, wiping his hands on a rag. You all right, man? You've been out of it all morning. I hesitated. Roy and I had been friends since high school, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to talk about everything. Still, the look on his face told me he wasn't going to let it go. I think Stacy's cheating on me, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Roy raised an eyebrow, then leaned against the workbench. You think or you know? I told him everything, about the texts, the cabin, the flower guy. By the time I finished, Roy was shaking his head, his jaw clenched. Man, I hate to say it, but that doesn't sound like a misunderstanding, he said. What are you gonna do? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to confront her again, but what's the point? She's already lied to me once. How do I know she won't do it again? Roy was quiet for a moment, then he sighed. Look, Jake, you've got a kid to think about. Whatever you decide, you've got to put Robbie first. But if it were me, I'd want answers. That afternoon, I left work early. I couldn't wait any longer. When I got home, Stacy was in the kitchen, making coffee like it was any other day. For a second, I just stood there, watching her. She looked the same as she always had, her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup, but she felt like a stranger. We need to talk, I said, breaking the silence. She looked up, her expression guarded. About what? About Tony. About us. About whatever the hell's been going on behind my back. She set down her mug and crossed her arms. I told you, it's not what you think. Then tell me what it is, I said, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around with another man while I'm here raising our son and keeping this family together. Her face twisted with anger. You don't get it, Jake. You never have. I've spent years feeling stuck in this life, watching you be perfectly content while I'm drowning. Drowning? I said, my voice cracking. We had a good life, Stacy. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. When did that stop being enough for you? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look away. It's not about you. It's about me. I needed more. I needed to feel alive again. Alive? I spat. So you found that was some flower delivery guy? Was it worth it? She flinched, but she didn't deny it. And that was all the confirmation I needed. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. Where are you going? She called after me, her voice trembling. Out, I said, not bothering to look back. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of everything. Part of me wanted to scream, to break something, to make her feel the same pain she'd caused me. But what good would that do? Eventually, I found myself at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody asks questions. I ordered a coffee and sat in a booth by the window, staring out at the empty parking lot. I thought about Robbie, about how I was going to explain this to him. He was too young to understand the details, but he'd know something was wrong. Kids always do. By the time I got home, it was past midnight. The house was dark, and Stacy was asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled over her shoulders. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, wondering how we'd gotten here. I wanted to wake her up, to demand answers, to make her tell me why I wasn't enough. But instead, I went to Robbie's room and sat by his bed, listening to the sound of his breathing. This wasn't just about me anymore. Whatever happened next, I had to protect him. The next morning felt heavier than usual. The weight of everything, Stacy's betrayal, the lies, the shattered picture of what I thought my life was, pressed down on me like a vice. Robbie's laughter from the kitchen brought me back to reality. He was sitting at the table, happily munching on cereal, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the house. Stacy was there too, making him a sandwich for lunch like nothing had changed. I couldn't look at her without my stomach twisting. Every smile she gave Robbie felt fake, like she was playing a part. Did she even feel guilty? Or was she just so far gone that none of this mattered to her anymore? I kissed Robbie on the top of his head before he left for school, watching him skip to the bus with his backpack bouncing. Once he was gone, the house fell into silence. Stacy stood by the sink, sipping her coffee, her back to me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. She set her mug down but didn't turn around. "About what? You know damn well about what." I felt my voice rise despite trying to stay calm. "I've been giving you the benefit of the doubt, Stacy, but I can't do this anymore. I saw you with him." "I know." Her shoulders stiffened, but she still wouldn't look at me. "Jake, No excuses." I cut her off. "I want the truth. How long has this been going on? What does he mean to you?" She finally turned around, her face pale. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I thought maybe she was going to try lying again. But then she sighed, her hands trembling as she leaned against the counter. "For months," she said quietly. "It started as nothing, just some harmless flirting. I didn't think it would go anywhere." "Harmless?" I laughed bitterly. "You've been sneaking off to a cabin with this guy, and you're calling it harmless?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. Not this time. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Jake," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't plan this. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I snapped. "You did. You hurt me, you hurt Robbie, and you destroyed everything we had. Was it worth it?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to keep from falling apart. "I can't do this anymore, Stacy," I said, my voice quieter now. "I can't live like this, wondering where you are and who you're with. If you're not willing to end it, then we're done." She looked at me then, her eyes wide with panic. "Jake, please. Don't say that." No," I interrupted. "You made your choice when you started seeing him. Now it's my turn to make mine." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Stacy stayed locked in the bedroom, and I buried myself in work at the garage, trying to keep my mind off everything. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of her with Tony kept flashing in my head. When I got home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. Robbie was in his room, and Stacy was sitting on the couch, a suitcase by her feet. "What's this?" I asked, though I already knew. She looked up at me, her face tear-streaked and tired. "I'm going to my sister's for a while. I think we need some time apart." I stared at her, my chest tightening. Part of me wanted to yell, to beg her to stay, to fight for what we had. But another part of me knew it was too late. "Fine," I said, my voice flat. But you'd better make up your mind fast, Stacy. Because I'm not waiting around forever. She nodded, grabbing her suitcase and heading for the door. She paused for a moment, glancing back at me. Tell Robbie I'll call him tomorrow, she said softly. I didn't reply. I just watched her walk out the door, the sound of it closing behind her echoing in the empty house. That night, I sat in Robbie's room, watching him sleep. I felt like a failure, like I'd let him down, like I hadn't done enough to keep our family together. But as I listened to his steady breathing, I realized something. I hadn't failed him. Stacy had. From that moment on, I knew what I had to do. I had to be there for Robbie, no matter what. He was my priority now, and nothing, no betrayal, no heartbreak, was going to change that. The days after Stacy left were some of the hardest of my life. The house felt emptier without her, and Robbie kept asking when his mom was coming home. I didn't know what to tell him, so I stuck to vague answers like, "She's taking some time to think." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. At night, after Robbie went to bed, I sat in the garage with a beer in my hand, staring at the half-finished Mustang I'd been working on for months. Normally, the hum of an engine or the feel of tools in my hands could calm me, but now it all felt meaningless. I couldn't stop thinking about Stacy, about how everything we'd built together had crumbled so quickly. I tried to push the anger down, to stay focused on Robbie, on work, on anything that wasn't her. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her laugh, the way she used to look at me like I was her whole world. And then I saw her with him. One night, about a week after she left, I got a call from Stacy's sister, Lisa. "Hey, Jake," she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to check in. Stacy's been staying here, and she's not doing great." I gritted my teeth, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not sure what you want me to say, Lisa." She made her choices. "I know," Lisa said, her tone soft. "And I'm not defending what she did. But I think you should know, she's really struggling. She misses you. She misses Robbie." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to believe it, to hope that maybe she regretted everything and wanted to come back. But another part of me, the part that still saw her walking into that cabin with Tony, wasn't ready to forgive her. "I appreciate the call, Lisa," I said finally. "But this is something Stacy and I need to figure out on our own." "Of course," she said. "Just don't give up on her yet, okay?" After I hung up, I sat in the garage for a long time, staring at the phone. Did I even want her back? Could I forgive her if she asked me to? The next morning I got my answer. It was a Saturday, and Robbie and I were at the park, tossing a football back and forth. He was laughing, his cheeks flushed from running around, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of peace. Then I saw her. Stacy was standing by the edge of the playground, her arms crossed, watching us. She looked different, smaller somehow, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. Robbie saw her before I could say anything. His face lit up, and he ran toward her, shouting, "Mommy!" She knelt down, catching him in her arms, tears streaming down her face. I stayed where I was, unsure of what to do. After a few minutes, Stacy stood up, holding Robbie's hand as she walked toward me. "Hey," she said softly, her eyes red and puffy. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. We stood there in awkward silence until Robbie ran off to play with some other kids. Then Stacy looked at me, her expression full of regret. "Jake, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you that. I needed you to know." I crossed my arms, unsure of what to say. Why now? Why not before everything fell apart? She looked down, wiping her eyes. "I don't know. I was selfish. I got caught up in something I thought I wanted, and I didn't realize what I was throwing away until it was too late." "Was it worth it?" I asked, my voice cold. "Was he worth it?" Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. "No. God, no. It was never about him, Jake. I was trying to fill some hole inside me, and I thought, I thought maybe he could. But all it did was make me realize how much I've lost. I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Do you think you can forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I thought about everything we'd been through, the life we'd built, and the pain she'd caused. Forgiveness felt like a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb. "I don't know, Stacy," I said finally. "This isn't something I can just forget. And it's not just about me. It's about Robbie too. I have to think about what's best for him." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I wanted you to know that I love you. And I'm sorry." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, unsure of what the future held. That night, after Robbie was asleep, I sat in the garage staring at the Mustang. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: my son needed me, and I wasn't going to let him down. Whatever happened with Stacy, I'd figure it out. One day at a time. The days after Stacy's apology were a strange mix of relief and tension. She called Robbie every night, keeping their conversations light and cheerful, but she didn't push to come home. I think she knew I wasn't ready for that, and honestly, I didn't know if I ever would be. Meanwhile, I threw myself into being a dad and a mechanic. Work at the garage picked up, and Robbie started t-ball, which gave me something to look forward to every weekend. But no matter how busy I stayed, I couldn't stop thinking about Stacy. Her words, her tears, her regret, it all stuck with me, even when I didn't want it to. One evening, Roy and I were sitting on the tailgate of his truck after work, splitting a 6-pack of beer. The sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "So, how's it going with Stacy?" Roy asked, breaking the comfortable silence. I shrugged. "She apologized. Said all the right things. But I don't know, man. I don't know if I can trust her again." Roy nodded, taking a long sip of his beer. "Trust's a funny thing. Takes years to build, and one bad decision to wreck it. But here's the question: do you think she's serious about fixing things? Or is she just saying what she thinks you want to hear?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Stacy's words had seemed genuine, but how could I be sure? "I don't know," I admitted. "I mean, she seemed real sorry. But sorry doesn't undo what she did." Roy clapped a hand on my shoulder. "True. But if you think there's even a chance you can work it out, it's worth trying. For Robbie's sake, if nothing else." I nodded, staring at the horizon. I didn't say it out loud, but I was scared. Scared of letting her back in, only to get hurt all over again. The next day, Stacy texted me, asking if we could meet for coffee. She said she wanted to talk, really talk, without Robbie around. After some hesitation, I agreed. We met at a little diner just off the highway, the kind of place we used to go to when we were dating. Stacy was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth by the window. She looked nervous, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Hey," I said as I slid into the booth across from her. "Hey," she replied, her voice soft. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she took a deep breath and launched into it. "I know I hurt you, Jake. And I know there's nothing I can say to make up for what I did. But I need you to know that I'm committed to making things right. For you, for Robbie, for our family." I studied her face, looking for any sign of insincerity. But all I saw was raw emotion. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I said honestly. "How do I know you're not just going to get bored with me and Robbie and go looking for someone else?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Because I've seen what life looks like without you. Without us. And it's not a life I want. I was stupid, Jake. I took everything we had for granted, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm asking for one more chance. Just one." I leaned back in the booth, running a hand through my hair. "It's not just about me, Stacy. It's about Robbie. He deserves a stable home, and I can't give him that if I'm constantly wondering if you're going to walk out again." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. And I promise, I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need. Just tell me how to fix this. The sincerity in her voice gave me pause. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who laughed at my bad jokes and spent Saturday nights watching movies on the couch with me. But I also saw the pain she'd caused, the cracks in our family that might never fully heal. I'll think about it, I said finally. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you. That night, I sat on the porch after putting Robbie to bed, staring up at the stars. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, hope, fear. I didn't know if Stacy and I could ever go back to the way things were, but a small part of me wanted to try. For Robbie's sake. For our sake. For the life we'd built together. The following week was a blur of cautious interactions and tense silences. Stacy had started texting me more frequently, updates about Robbie, little anecdotes from her day, even some apologies that felt like they were coming straight from her heart. I didn't respond much, keeping things short and to the point. I wasn't ready to let my guard down, not yet. One night, she called. I was sitting in the garage, the Mustang's hood propped open in front of me, when my phone buzzed on the workbench. Her name lit up the screen, and for a second, I thought about ignoring it. But something made me pick up. Hey, I said, my voice even. Hey, she replied, sounding unsure of herself. I wanted to check in. How are you? I almost laughed. How was I? How the hell did she think I was? But instead I said, I'm fine. Robbie's good too. I'm glad, she said softly. Jake, I know I don't deserve it, but I was hoping we could talk more. Maybe figure out a way to move forward. I sighed, leaning against the workbench. Stacy, I'm not ready to make any decisions. You can't expect me to just forget what happened. I know, she said quickly. I don't expect that. I want to try. For Robbie. For us. Even if it's slow. Even if it takes years. I'll wait as long as it takes. Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. She sounded sincere, but was that enough? Could I ever trust her again? The next day, I decided to take a step, just a small one. I asked her to come over for dinner. Not as a family, not as husband and wife, but as Robbie's parents. He deserved to have us both in his life, even if we were broken. When she showed up that evening, Robbie ran to the door, throwing his arms around her waist. The way her face lit up at the sight of him made something in my chest ache. Dinner was awkward, to say the least. We kept the conversation light, talking about Robbie's school and the garage and other safe topics. But underneath it all was a tension neither of us could ignore. After we put Robbie to bed, Stacy lingered in the kitchen, fiddling with the edge of the counter. Thank you for letting me come over, she said quietly. I nodded, leaning against the fridge. Robbie needs both of us. That's what matters. I want more than that, she admitted, her voice trembling. I want us to be a family again. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm willing to fight for it. For you. Her words hit me like a gut punch. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let her back in and try to rebuild what we'd lost. But another part of me, the part that had watched her walk into that cabin with Tony, wasn't ready to forgive. I don't know, Stacy, I said finally. It's not that simple. Trust doesn't come back overnight. I understand, she said, tears shining in her eyes. But I'm not giving up on us, Jake. Not ever. She left shortly after, leaving me alone in the quiet house. Over the next few weeks, we started spending more time together, not as a couple, but as parents. We took Robbie to his t-ball games, had dinner together once a week, even went on a trip to the park. Slowly, the walls between us began to crack, though they didn't completely crumble. One day, as we were watching Robbie climb the jungle gym, Stacy turned to me. I've been going to therapy, she said out of nowhere. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Yeah, she said, fiddling with the strap of her purse. It's helping me understand why I made the choices I did. Why I felt so lost. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I thought you should know. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Part of me was glad she was trying to take responsibility, but another part wondered if it was too little, too late. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself facing a decision I wasn't ready to make, whether to forgive Stacy and try to rebuild our marriage, or to let her go and move on. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about Robbie, about the life we'd built, about the future we all deserved. One night, as I tucked Robbie into bed, he looked up at me with his big, trusting eyes. "Dad, is Mommy gonna come back and live with us?" he asked. I hesitated, stroking his hair. "I don't know, buddy. We're still figuring things out." "Okay," he said, yawning. "I hope she does. I miss her." His words stayed with me long after he fell asleep. Maybe it was time to stop focusing on what had been lost and start thinking about what could be saved. As the weeks stretched into months, life settled into a strange rhythm. Stacy and I continued our cautious interactions, mostly centered around Robbie. Dinner once a week, t-ball games on Saturdays, and occasional coffee chats about logistics, school schedules, doctor appointments, the little things that still tied us together. Robbie seemed happier, or at least less confused. He still asked every now and then when Stacy would come back home, but he'd stopped sounding so sad when I didn't have an answer. In some ways, I think he was adapting better than I was. One evening, after Robbie was asleep, Stacy texted me. "Can we talk? Just the two of us?" I stared at the screen for a long time before responding, "Sure. Tomorrow night. I'll come to you." When the time came, I parked outside Lisa's house, my stomach churning. Stacy opened the door almost immediately, like she'd been waiting by the window. She looked nervous but hopeful, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and no makeup on her face. She looked more like the girl I married than the woman who had walked out of our lives months ago. "Thanks for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The living room was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and pictures of Lisa's kids on the walls. Stacy motioned for me to sit on the couch, and for a moment, we just sat there in silence. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "About us. About everything that happened." "Me too," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She glanced at me, her green eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know where to start. I guess I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. For what I did to you, to Robbie, to our family." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Stacy, I've heard you say you're sorry. And I believe you mean it. But sorry doesn't fix things. It doesn't undo what happened." "I know," she said quickly. "That's why I'm not just saying it. I'm trying to show you that I've changed. I've been in therapy every week since I left. I've been working on myself, figuring out why I felt so empty, why I let myself do something so selfish. And I want to keep working, for as long as it takes." Her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. "I love you, Jake. I never stopped. And I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway. Not because it'll be easy, but because I think we're worth it." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stared at the carpet, trying to sort through the mess of emotions swirling inside me. "Do you still see him?" I asked finally, my voice low. She shook her head quickly, almost desperately. "No. I ended it the day you confronted me. I haven't spoken to him since. He meant nothing, Jake. I see that now. It wasn't about him. It was about me running from my own problems instead of facing them." I looked up at her, searching her face for any sign of dishonesty. But all I saw was raw, unfiltered regret. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "And even if I do, I don't know if things will ever be the same. I don't expect them to be," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just want a chance to try. To prove to you and Robbie that I can be better. That I can be the wife and mother you both deserve. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever. Finally, I took a deep breath and said the words I'd been scared to say for weeks. I'm willing to try. But it's not going to be easy. And it's going to take a hell of a lot of work. Relief flooded her face, and she nodded quickly. I understand. And I'll do whatever it takes, Jake. I promise. That night, as I drove home, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, fear, hope, doubt. I wasn't sure if we could make it work, but for the first time in months, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. The weeks that followed were filled with small steps forward and big leaps of faith. Stacy started coming over more often, spending time with Robbie and helping out around the house. We went to counseling together, airing out years of buried resentment and hurt. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. One night, after we'd tucked Robbie into bed, Stacy and I sat on the porch, sipping beers and watching the stars. Remember when we used to do this? She asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. Yeah, I said, leaning back in my chair. Feels like a lifetime ago. It does, she agreed. But I'm glad we're here now. I glanced at her, studying her face in the soft glow of the porch light. For the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the woman I fell in love with, the one who laughed at my dumb jokes and made me believe in forever. And for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to that. The months that followed were a slow, uphill climb. Stacy and I were trying to rebuild something fragile, something that felt like it could shatter if either of us pushed too hard or moved too fast. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were working together. Counseling became a regular thing, and though I wasn't exactly thrilled to sit in a room and talk about my feelings, it helped. Our therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, didn't let either of us dodge the hard questions. She made Stacy dig into the reasons behind her choices, forcing her to confront the emptiness she said she'd been running from. She also made me face some truths I didn't want to hear, about how I'd gotten too comfortable, too complacent, and how I hadn't noticed Stacy slipping away until it was too late. It's not about blaming yourself for her actions, Karen said during one session. But it's important to understand how both of you contributed to the cracks in your marriage. It stung, but I couldn't deny it. I'd been so focused on my own world, Robbie, the garage, my love for simple things, that I'd missed the signs that Stacy needed more. Outside of counseling, we tried to find small ways to reconnect. Stacy started coming over more often, cooking dinner with me and Robbie or joining us for movie nights. At first it felt forced, like we were both playing roles we weren't sure we belonged in anymore. But over time, it started to feel real again. One evening, after Robbie had gone to bed, Stacy stayed late to help me clean up. We ended up sitting in the kitchen, talking over mugs of coffee like we used to when we were first married. I've been thinking about the cabin, she said suddenly, her voice soft. I stiffened, unsure of where she was going with this. I know I can't erase what happened there, she continued. But I need you to know that it wasn't about him. It was never about him. I was trying to escape from my own life, from my own fears, and he was just there. I stared into my coffee, struggling to process her words. I don't expect you to forgive me for it, she said, her voice trembling. But I needed to say it out loud. I needed you to know. I nodded slowly, still not trusting myself to speak. The truth was, I didn't know if I'd ever completely forgive her. But I could see she was trying. And for now, that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, Stacy and I started finding a new rhythm. She moved back into the house, tentatively at first, with most of her things still at Lisa's. But the more time she spent with Robbie and me, the more it started to feel like home again. There were still moments of tension, moments when the past crept back in and threatened to undo everything we'd worked for. But we'd learned to face those moments together, to talk about them instead of letting them fester. One Saturday, as we watched Robbie's t-ball game, I caught Stacy smiling at me from across the bleachers. It wasn't the tentative smile of someone trying to fix things. It was the smile of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Later that night, as we sat on the porch, she reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were?" she asked quietly. I thought about it for a moment, staring up at the stars. "No," I said finally. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need to go back. Maybe we just need to figure out where we're going next." She nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. "I like that." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. It's been a year now since everything fell apart, and while life isn't perfect, it's better. Stacy and I are still working on rebuilding trust, but we're in it together. Robbie's happier than I've ever seen him, and every day, I'm reminded of why I chose to fight for this family. Stacy and I have learned that love isn't just about the good times. It's about sticking it out through the bad, about choosing each other even when it's hard. And as I sit here on the porch, watching Robbie chase fireflies in the yard while Stacy laughs beside me, I realize something. We didn't just save our marriage. We saved each other.